ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music, and more.
Before today, I would have said a blacksmith is maybe a medieval guy who hangs out in a stable somewhere, banging at a sword, perhaps. And that is kind of correct, except for the medieval part, because blacksmiths very much exist today. In fact, Matt Mewburn is one. But even he had to discover the trade because up until his 20s, he assumed he'd one day run the family farm or become a scientist. But after tragedy struck the Mewburn family when Matt was just 20 years old, he went looking for himself. Matt rolled up to the local TAFE, searching for something to do to distract him and keep his hands busy. It was there he discovered blacksmiths weren't a relic of 19th century rail sheds, or medieval armories, or oddities at the local Renaissance fair. And he fell in love with the trade. Matt is now the custodian of the historic Everleigh Railway Workshops here in Sydney, also known as the Iron Cathedral. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Take me to the Iron Cathedral. What is the Everleigh Workshop like? Because I assumed it was all sort of just restaurants and office blocks down there now.
Yeah, so it's undergone a development reasonably recently, and it's had a few iterations of its life. But the cool part about Ways 1 and 2, which is where I operate the business Everleigh works out of, is that it has been a constantly running blacksmith shop since 1887. So it's not a curated space. It's not something that's been put together as a museum exhibition. It's been a fully working industrial blacksmithing space since its inception. It was designed that way. And one of the most wonderful things is it's evolved over that period of time as well. So it's not just the relic of the past that it was when it was first built, but, you know, as blacksmithing changed and as the requirements of the railways changed, that space kind of morphed with it. But to have that unbroken line means that there's equipment in there that dates back to the 1850s.
Wow.
There are tools in that workshop that were made well over 100 years ago by people that we'll never know. You know, they have touch marks on them, but they're not identified as people. They're just workers that were once part of the railway, this huge railway network, the largest employer of blacksmiths in its day. So that's a bit of the genesis story, but now it's more, blacksmithing has changed a lot and it's become more about contemporary ironwork. It's more decorative, it's more sculptural. You know, there isn't that huge industrial requirement that there was even 30 or 40 years ago when the railways decided to close Everleigh as a locomotive maintenance shop.
What does the space look like? Because I don't think most people have been into a blacksmith's workshop.
Well, I mean, and I do really affectionately refer to it as the industrial cathedral because that's kind of what it evokes for me. You know, you walk into there's these big bay doors at the southern end and you come through the door and you're just greeted with this enormous cavernous sort of space, very high ceilings. It's got beautiful wrought iron roof joists all the way throughout. It's very much in that design theme of the Victorian era railway workshops throughout the world. Yeah, you walk into the space and it's huge. And then the next thing that hits you is the beauty of a lot of the machinery that's in there. So it was really created and brought over at a time where when people were designing them, you know, they were an industrial utility, but they were still beautiful. You know, they've got kind of those Nouveau curves and they've got a shapeliness about them that they cast a really beautiful shadow. So when I walk in, and I've been there coming on 9 years now,
oh, wow.
I can still walk through the doors and I can still find nuance that I fall in love with, and I can still kind of take a gasp of the air in there and appreciate what an incredible space that it is.
Yeah, and is all the machinery from the 1800s, as you said, or has it been modernized as well?
Some of it has evolved, certainly. So the bigger pieces, they tend to be the older pieces because they're just so difficult to get around. And the technology of blacksmithing hasn't changed dramatically either. So there's the three primary components. You know, you've got fire, that's the way that we heat up the steel, and that has changed over time. So sometimes we use coke forges, solid fuel forges, we use gas forges, we use oil forges. And recently I bought an induction forge that is really great for, you can use electricity to heat up very specific areas in the material. But it's all the same. It's just putting energy into the steel. Steel's the second component. So it's, you know, iron and carbon. It's just the most ubiquitous building alloy. And when you find it cold, you know, you see a steel bar on the ground, it doesn't excite you. It doesn't really grab your attention. But as soon as you introduce heat to it, it becomes playful. It becomes plastic. It becomes this thing that it moves in ways that you would never expect if you were just finding it in its cold, kind of unyielding, regular, everyday state. And then there's force. That's the third part of the triangle. So the force hasn't changed either. You know, you talk about medieval blacksmiths, They had hand hammers and they had what we call in the trade strikers. So they're like trade assistants that would hold a sledgehammer, and on the blacksmith's will, they would put force into this object and squish it against an anvil.
Right.
Anvils, for those at home that don't know, they're the thing that Roadrunner is always trying to drop on to Wile E. Coyote, or vice versa, sorry. And they haven't really changed that much either, but you've got this big resistive mass on the bottom, you've got a sledgehammer on the top, and then that evolved during the Industrial Revolution into steam hammers and heavy steam presses later on. It can't be understated how important that evolution was.
What does it sound like in there when everything's in full flight? Because this sounds like very loud
It is.
activity.
It's a real symphony of noise. So and again, something I love about these old machines, they all have their language. They've all got their own little vocabulary. And so, a power hammer, it's like a bass drum. It's very repetitive, but it's really on the beat. The rate of blows doesn't change. The weight of the blows, how heavy you hit does, but, a power hammer just sits there and it's boom, boom, boom. And that kind of creates the bass track for the rest of the workshop.
Right.
And then, we've got the big guillotine's got a huge flywheel on it and it's got a dog gear. So every time it does a revolution on the dog gear, you hear a little tick over, and there's just these little nuanced sounds that you get to know. And a big part of my custodianship at Everley is we take on the maintenance challenge there as well, which is not a small feat. So getting to know the language of these machines and being acquainted with what sounds normal and what starts not to sound normal, because these machines are old enough that we don't have maintenance brochures. We don't have a sales rep that we can call up and say, "G'day, Barry, I've got a weird thing going on. What's this?" That doesn't exist anymore. So you're at first principles to go to this machine, and this is how it sounds. This is how it should sound. It's very analog. It's very kind of bespoke to each machine. So it's a hell of a noise.
Yeah. I imagine a very noisy space. I also imagine a really hot space, with all the fires burning. How hot does it get in there?
Well, that's shop by shop. So Everley, as we were talking about, it's this cavernous space, and it was designed. These people knew that it was going to be full of fire. It was going to have heavy industrial equipment, that all that friction is throwing heat. So it drafts incredibly well.
Okay.
There's the roof is very high, and it's got louvers all the way through. When we open the doors, the big bay doors, the draw through those doors is quite immense, and you can stand in the door when you're hot and you're sweaty from working. Go and stand in the doorway and the draft just pulls past you. So the workshop's not hot like people would think.
Wow.
Standing in front of the furnace is hot. And something that happens more often than not is on a really hot day, people say to me, "Oh God, it must be awful to be a blacksmith."
Yeah.
We had a news crew come down a couple of years ago because it was one of those Sydney days. And you know how they do a puff piece of, "It's a really hot day, let's go somewhere that's really hot."
Always, yes.
So we had a news crew show up at the blacksmith shop talking about how it was a 40-degree day, and it would have been comfortably 10 degrees cooler in our workshop.
How important was Everley to Australia's history and growth?
Immensely. I mean, it was the first of its kind. It was the largest of its kind. It was really responsible for the early proliferation of agriculture in Australia, being able to bring wheat and wool into the cities through. I mean, we're on Harris Street here. There's big wool stores all up and down the street going down into Darling Harbour. We're right next to the goods line. That was all of the rail infrastructure that came into Central Station, headed to the goods line, got on tall ships and then left through the harbour. That was all made possible by Everley being the largest and as I said, the earliest. They didn't build steam locos there initially. They were all brought over from the UK. So it was more of a repair facility, but it's all of the infrastructure. It's the tooling, it's hand tools, it's chisels, it's crowbars. The whole rail network, all of those maintenance workers had to be supplied with equipment and parts that were coming out of railway workshops.
Are you still in awe of the space?
Can you hear it?
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. And, you've got to pinch yourself, because as far as what I do for a living, that's the place to do it. And I've often joked, and I don't know how serious I really am about this. I think if I ever had to put my hammer down and I wasn't blacksmithing in that space, if things changed or, the city just wasn't for me anymore, I don't know how I'd keep doing it, because it's such, it's like working in the palace. It's such an incredible place to do what I do. It really is the crown jewel of that kind of industrial heritage. It would be very difficult to step away and do it in a smaller capacity somewhere else.
You grew up a world away from this kind of work. You grew up on a farm. Where was that farm?
The nearest town people would possibly know about is a town called Boorowa. It's closer to a town called Frogmore or Rugby, but it was about 4 hours southwest of Sydney.
And what was life like on that farm?
Look, I loved it. I mean, I think you grow up knowing what you know, and that was just what I knew growing up. I've always felt that call for the bush. I've always loved kind of kicking my shoes off and just being in the dust of it. I love going out to the desert. I've got a really dear friend, Uncle Badger Vates, that lives out in Broken Hill. I got to visit him earlier in the year. And it's just those environments. It's the same feeling actually as I get walking into Everleigh. It's the sense of expanse. It's that you can stand on a hill that you've just walked up for 20 minutes and you can turn around and see hills that would take you 3 days to walk to. It's that experience. It's the majesty of kind of being in Mother Nature. And I know in my heart of hearts, like I'd miss the beautiful cuisine. I'd miss stuff.
Lots to love,
right?
yeah.
Like there is lots to love in the city. But when I sit down in my honest moments and think about where I want to end up when I'm on a rocking chair, looking out to the horizon, I don't want buildings in the road.
Right.
I don't think about other people in the road. I want to be in that element of kind of communing more with nature.
Yeah. And what was the land like that you guys were farming? What were you farming?
So that district is really famous for fine wool. And again, back to the Everleigh connection, there used to be a railway line that came all the way through that area for taking them. So some of the really early pioneering families of superfine merino wool came from that area. It was settled by kind of Irish settlers. And so we were following suit. We grew fine wool, we grew fat lambs. We had some racehorses that were kind of a hangover from my grandfather. That was his passion. So yeah, the farm for me, and I think coming up with my dad, living where you work, living where you in that environment, it ingrains in you, I think.
What was your family like?
So I'm from a big family now. I'm the first of 5. So there's 4 boys and 1 girl, poor Prue, my sister. Being the eldest boy as well, it's part of kind of growing up on the farm is you want to follow your dad around. You want to be in his shoes. You want to be wherever he's going on the motorbike or when he's sitting on the tractor. You want to be out in that. And Boorowa, you asked about it before. It was a very wealthy area in its early days because of this immense wool money that was coming in. So you can walk down the main street of Boorowa and the shop fronts are very grand. They're very of their period. The Catholic Church there is one of the most beautiful churches you'd find in a regional setting. It's every window is stained glass. It's all very marble and gilded, and it's very high Roman Catholic. It's a really, really beautiful church. So there was traditionally always a lot of money there. But by the time that I got to be, by the time I was born, the pendulum had swung, and farming was much more difficult. And, there'd been kind of consecutive drought periods. Some of my earliest memories of the farm were always kind of the oppressive heat and the dust. And it was not that I ever saw it this way, but it was a very hostile kind of environment at that stage. And, that's farming 101. You take the good with the bad. Something that really sits at odds with me living in the city now is this concept of perpetual growth. Every quarter you've got to have more profit. Every company needs to make more profits for their shareholders. And it's like you've only got to sit on a farm for a couple of seasons and you realise that that's just not the world that we live in.
Yeah.
You're going to have good times, you're going to have bad times. And if you don't put away in the good times, your bad times are going to be really bad. I never sensed that. We certainly never grew up feeling poor. But now that I look back as an adult, I realise that my parents did an incredible job with what they had because it was a difficult time to be a farmer in that district.
What was the dynamic between your parents like growing up?
Look, my dad was he was pretty old school. I think, my mum is an incredibly generous, incredibly caring person. They had their traditional roles. It was very much, the father was the breadwinner. He was out on the farm. He was working. Mum was very much at home. We always had incredible meals. I mean, to this day, I still don't eat lamb because we grew up on a sheep farm, and just the smell of cooking lamb, you'd think it would drift you back to a happy time, but we just ate so much lamb, I never want to see it again. I'm full of lamb. I'm full. But that was my upbringing. It was. They were 2 sides of the coin, but they were very different entities in the household. Dad was very much the disciplinarian. Mum was very much the soft touch.
As the eldest son, as you mentioned, what was your bond like with your dad?
It's not something you put into words. And I think sons will just know this. Times are shifting, but I think, back then there was that expectation that you would kind of run a farm, and certainly maybe my generation, but more so the generation before me, a big impetus for having kids was to have labour working on the farm.
Yeah.
And I never felt that pressure. I don't say for a second that my dad ever was pushing me towards running the farm and wanting, maybe actually the contrary. He probably saw and probably knew how difficult it was and knew that he would probably like an easier life for me than the one that he was having, particularly at that time.
Did you want to take over the family
I did.
farm?
I absolutely did. And even as we were talking about before, I still, when I think about being grey and I think about sitting on a veranda somewhere, I don't need a huge farm, but I want it to be big enough that I can go for a walk and get a bit lost. That's something I'm excited about and something I really am still working towards, I guess.
So I guess, okay, one day you might find yourself back on a farm, but for your family farm, you didn't end up taking it over because your parents eventually got divorced.
Yeah.
They let go of the farm and you moved to Sydney to finish school. Where did life take you from there?
So Dad moved off the farm. He came back to Sydney. So he had a qualification in, he joined the Air Force as a 16-year-old. So he was originally working on radars and things like that for the Mirages. So he kind of leant back on that credential. He moved back up to Sydney and he got his first job back up in Sydney repairing tellies and microwaves and consumer goods because he had that electronic background.
And what were you doing in the city at this point?
I had gone away to school, yeah. I'd kind of been sent away to boarding school. I didn't initially want to go, because all I knew this small country town, I knew the farm, and I just wanted to be there. And Mum had decided that wasn't going to be my lot in life. She was determined that I was going to at least go and try and see a little bit more and do a little bit more and find out what the rest of the world held.
Right.
But I loved it. I mean, I went, and initially I missed the farm and I'd complain about not being around and not being able to ride motorbikes and do all that stuff that I loved. But I think fairly comfortably after the first 6 months or so, I was really loving it. And I realised then that, I cared about my education. I cared about what was going to happen next, and I wanted to stay.
And what did you decide you wanted to study then after school finished?
I loved science. I always loved science. I love physics. I love chemistry, that sort of thing. So I decided I was going to go to uni. I went to ANU for a little bit, studying Bachelor of Science. I really wanted to get into astronomy.
And so while you were studying in Canberra, did you come back to visit your dad in Sydney and work with him?
Yeah, so I'd always, even in my school holidays from high school, I would come into the business and I'd help him run cables and I'd pick stuff up. And again, the electronics was so close and familiar to the science that I loved, and it was very, it's very logically applied. It's the sort of thing that, you can sit down with a piece of paper and you can figure out these complex solutions, and I really loved that about it. So he would always take me under his wing in much the same way we did on the farm. So I'd get these calls on the school holidays and we'd spend a week running cables for each other, I'd spend a week underneath buildings running cables in areas that he was too big to get into. I'm sure there's child labour laws against this, but it was a small business and we got away with a lot.
Right.
And so I'd had that introduction and I had that experience. So when he got a diagnosis of cancer, we kind of had a conversation not long after to say, well, you're coming on a uni break, and I don't think I had to be back until March. And he sort of said, I'll be finished my treatment by then. This might knock me around. Do you mind? Take my mobile phone, kind of just babysit the business. And it wasn't at arm's length. I could call him for advice. He wasn't hospitalised. He was fairly bedridden, but he wasn't kind of decrepit.
What was the diagnosis?
Bowel cancer, and fairly positive. There was an optimistic diagnosis. So I think all of the health professionals were happy that it was caught early and fairly content with what it was, how it was, where it was, and
it's very treatable if it's caught early.
It was found to be very treatable. That was always the dialogue. It was a shock, but I don't remember being overwhelmingly fearful. I don't remember being terrified at his mortality. Certainly, it was a hiccup. It was, he's got this health niggle, and we're going to just get in there and we just do what we have to do to get through it, sort of thing.
When was he diagnosed with bowel cancer?
So that was November, and then he'd completed his treatment. We were living together, so obviously I was just staying with him while I was running the business. That was the plan, and that was how it was supposed to go. And then, it was late January, I got this devastating phone call that he was not here.
This is so shocking. So he was well, the prognosis was good. Had you noticed anything about his health or his spirits to suggest otherwise?
No, and quite the opposite. He had gone through the treatment and it had been difficult. It's bowel cancer. Anyone that has seen a family member or had it themselves, it's very physical, it's digestive tract. He had a lot of issues with his food, keeping food down. There were only very specific things that he could be bothered to eat. That was a difficult time. The treatment and kind of living with him through that period of it was difficult because there was the stress of the business. There's also just the stress of his kind of demeanour and completely understandably, but, he was fairly regularly in a bit of a shit mood, as you could expect.
Cancer will do that too, yes.
Exactly. So it was difficult coming in and through Christmas. Coming out the other side into January, it was actually really positive. He was starting to get up and do things. He was starting to be more active around the house. He was walking down to grab a paper from local servo. He was on the mend, very much so. And that's what made it so shocking, was that for my eyes, seeing him day to day, he was on the improvement. And I think something that I still, this is 20 years ago, I guess, but I still feel, you feel all those complicated emotions, but there's still an element of guilt of what could I have done different? I was living with him at the time, but I wasn't there when it happened. But again, he was feeling so much better, and it was almost this respite for me that I hadn't really been getting out of the house and I hadn't been doing anything else.
Where were you when you heard the news that he had died?
I was over at a friend's house. So I hadn't really been going out to see friends. I hadn't been doing all that much, but I just decided on this night that I was going to go to a friend's place, and because we'd had a couple of beers, I decided not to drive. So I didn't have a car with me. Because if I hadn't had a couple of beers, which is really unusual for me, I probably would have just driven home late that night and I'd have been there. But I wasn't, and I didn't. And so I was at my friend's place and I got this call from my little brother, and I just thought I didn't consider it to be final. I didn't really believe it. It was, something will happen, something will change, and it'll be okay. And so I sort of kept it quiet to myself. It was a really eerie kind of feeling that I had. So I think it was probably 15 or 20 minutes before I even said to any of my friends, because it was a share house, I was 20. And then I went to one of my good friends who'd kind of agreed well before to give me a lift home. And he was also dropping another friend off at another house over in Journeyman. So it was kind of a bit of a round circle trip. And after I'd sat with this news for a little bit, I kind of approached him and I said, man, I've got to go. I've got to go home. I've got some stuff to do. And he was like, do we have to go now? Because our other friend Luke's not ready. Don't be impatient. Mm-hmm. Was effective. He didn't say that, and he certainly didn't know what was going on. But that was the tone of it. He's like, yeah, we're going to go. Just hold your horses. And I was like, no, I've got to go now. I've got some stuff going on. And so we jumped in the car. Yeah.
It's been, 17 odd years since he passed? And I guess the death of a parent never leaves you. Like, the emotion is still so raw for you recounting this. Yeah,
totally. And I mean, I think it's because it was something that was so quick. I don't think, like, you process it in the moment, and I've processed it many times and I've cried over it many times since then. And I don't really want that emotion to go away. Like, I don't want to feel okay with this terrible thing. Yeah, I get emotional talking about my dad, and I don't feel that embarrassed about it because I think it's the realness of family.
Yeah. And I suppose it was shocking because the prognosis was good. He seemed fine. You wouldn't have had a chance to say goodbye.
Absolutely not. And that was, that's one of the many emotions that comes across. And I think there's also a lot wrapped up in losing your father particularly. I remember I had this discussion with one of my uncles when my mum's dad died, and we had that discussion about how profound it is to lose a father. What a shadow a father casts in a family.
Yeah.
And he was the eldest son of his generation. I'm the eldest son of my generation. So what those shoes look like to us in the huge power vacuum or the huge emotional vacuum that it is losing a father.
And so how did you move forward after this really terrible, unexpected news?
The realization came, and that hits you with a ton of bricks. And then there's all of the emotions that flood in. So there's, the grief and the anger at what is this my lot for? That sense of mourning, and you have people coming in. So his partner at the time, he was seeing somebody, his partner came in to the house. My family, we all kind of converged on Dad's house. So within a couple of hours of realising that he was gone, we were all together. And we spent the next couple of weeks staying at the house together as a big group. And I think that was a really healing thing. It was a really necessary thing too, because it's the bits that you have to do when someone dies that you don't want to think about, and you don't, as a 20-year-old, and, you know, I'd certainly never contemplated, but there's just a lot of formalities, you know? So having the family there at that time was really important. And the nature of our business, because we used to do things in high care environments, hospitals, nursing homes. So we were on call 24 hours a day. So I kind of went into autopilot, and so he died on a Sunday. Monday morning, I went into work. I just didn't really know what else I was going to do. I knew the business was going to happen anyway. You know, things are going to happen around me, and the world doesn't stop for what's going on in my life. So I think for lack of any better decision, I just decided I was going to get up and go to work. And his partner, who was working in the business, Janelle, incredible lady, she came in as well. We kind of opened the door together, and it was Monday, and it was the first day that I ran the business without him.
Podcast, broadcast. This is Conversations with Sana Kadar.
So Matt, you said after your father passed, he passed away on a Sunday, you went to work to run the family business on a Monday, which is incredible. But I suppose I can understand it. You're trying to put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
Were you keen to take over that business and run it?
Not in any shape. I really, even at that stage, even after Dad had gone, I really thought that I'd get back to uni. I think there was an element of obligation. I don't say that in a negative way, but I think there was the obligation that, you know, it was a small business and we were supporting other people. We had employees that were kind of relying on that business. So I think I felt an element of obligation to do the right thing by them. I also feel like I felt an obligation to the family to take a business that wasn't particularly saleable, because it had that notorious small business key man problem of like one person that just knows everything and knows where all of the intricacies live, and, you know, without that person it's really difficult. So I felt like I never felt equipped to take Dad's position, but I certainly felt like I was in the best position out of anybody else. So the plan was always to kind of build the business to something that it was at least documented, and it could be sold maybe.
And did you feel like you were fulfilling your father's legacy?
I didn't really. I think the business for him was a bit of a means to an end. I don't think electronics fulfilled him in some deep, you know, calling way, and it didn't for me either. So no, I don't think he ever had any grand hopes of me taking on that as a business, in much the same way he didn't for the farm. I think it was just his toy project. It meant he didn't have a boss. It meant he didn't have to do anything at any particular place at any particular time if he didn't want to.
Right, okay.
I think that's the biggest part of small business.
And so you eventually got that business to a position where you could sell it. You sold it. What then? And how did you think about where your life was at now that the business was sold, so your connection to your father in terms of the work you did together, that was gone, the farm is gone, what now?
Yeah, I didn't know what to do. I really didn't. And I'd always been restless to work with my hands, and I think that harks back to being on the farm and working with my hands. I'd always loved creating. I love that essential, bare bones, really distilled, pared back version of creation. You know, for me, that's what I was looking for. It was complete serendipity that I was living in Sydney at the time. I walked into a Sydney TAFE, which is the last TAFE in New South Wales that teaches blacksmithing as a trade level vocational education. So I thought it could be anything. Steel, I think, is where I landed because of some of the things I touched on earlier in the interview, where it's something that is so infinitely applicable. It can be as complicated and as nuanced as you want it to be, but it's also incredibly distilled, and it's rudimentary. It's force and it's energy, it's fire, it's steel. It's these really pure primal things that have been happening for thousands of years around the world, and independently generated in these far removed locations. You know, there's ironwork dating in Africa thousands thousands and thousands of years. You've got the famous Silk Road trading route that was moving steel from places like India and Pakistan all the way through to Europe, and it was sold into the Vikings. You know, this famous Ulfbert sword that was created. They've got no idea how the metallurgy happened for the technology of its day. Yes, I saw there was a couple of tables of things that were laid out there, and until I sort of glanced down and thought, wow, there's an incredible breadth of stuff here. And I hadn't considered steel as this plastic, deformable, organic material. I hadn't seen it like that. I'd only seen it in the way that a lot of people see it, as this cold, unyielding building material, this kind of straight, clean, neat, ubiquitous, invisible technology that is at the heart of modern life, but it's so invisible.
Yeah. You don't contemplate steel.
You don't think about steel. And, you know, to look across a table of tools that had been made and the before and after shots and the progress shots, that was something that really stood out to me. Of this material starts out as a lump with these dimensions, and you can't change the volume of steel, which means that you have to change its physical disposition. You know, you can't squeeze and compress steel. So if you squish it this way, it has to move. If you squeeze it on the X, it's got to go on the Y and the Z. It's got to go somewhere. It doesn't get any denser. So there were these tools laid out on the ground that you start with this fist-sized lump of steel, and then a section is isolated and drawn out, which is a term that we use for reducing the cross-section but increasing the length. And then an area might be upset, which is another term that we use for the exact opposite, where we take a piece of steel and we compress it, and in flattening it out, we make it fatter and broader in cross-section. So there's all these really wonderful techniques, and they're so simple, but they can be executed and employed in such a huge gamut of ways. And I think that's what really made me fall in love. It was just instantly I recognized that this was something that was going to be easy to learn and very difficult to master, and it was going to be something that could be employed in almost an endless, countless amount of ways. And so that's where, you know, the modern business kind of evolved.
What was the first thing you ever made?
Like most people, my blacksmithing journey started out with bladesmithing. I made a few knives, but I made a knife that I was really proud of for its time with a dear friend of mine, Keith Fludder, who runs classes, and he sort of took me into his shop and said, hey, this is how we do it, this is why we do it, this is what we're doing. And by the end of that, I'd created something that I really loved. And I think a lot of people come to bladesmithing first because the barrier to entry is a lot lower. You know, it's a smaller object, it's a more nuanced object, but I love the science of it too. You know, bladesmithing and something that I still really love about blacksmithing as well and tool making is there's a lot chemically that's happening at an atomic level with this material. It doesn't just matter what you put in as far as the cake recipe of the steel. You know, there's all these chromium, molybdenum, vanadium, tungsten. There's all these things that we add in to elicit certain mechanical properties, but it also matters how you treat it after that. So you can have the right cake mix, but if you don't bake it properly, you will have something that is ill fit for purpose or catastrophically fail. So, you know, there's a whole science and family of metallurgy that I love getting buried down into still.
Yeah, it's sort of a perfect marriage of what you were studying
it is,
and working
accidentally,
with your hands.
again, I didn't contrive it that way, but that's exactly what happened.
And so what is the pathway from picking up blacksmithing as a TAFE night class to becoming a fully fledged blacksmith?
So in Australia, we're very lucky actually. Most places around the world don't have trade level qualifications anymore for blacksmithing. It is still a vocation level. It's a certificate 3, you know, it gives you a cert 3 for you to go out into the world. But the sad reality is that there isn't a world to go out into. You can get that training, and most people that do it for the skill set. They don't do it for the job prospect.
Okay.
There are a couple of hundred trade level blacksmiths out there, according to the census, you know, people that put it down on their tax return year in, year out.
And I understand there's 2 camps overall with blacksmithing. There's the knife guys and
there is.
creative
They are a
guys.
bit different. And look, I think you really struggle to find someone that was existing wholeheartedly in one or the other. But yes, you get your architectural blacksmithing guys. That's probably where my business lives. We do a lot of public art projects. I've worked with some incredible artists around Australia and around the world. I love the challenge of working on that scale. And yeah, I think that pulls time away from the stuff like the knife making, but I still enjoy it.
As we've alluded to, blacksmithing feels like an anachronism. A lot of people would probably think of it as that. How old is the blacksmithing profession?
I mean, like tongue-in-cheek, they talk about it as the second oldest profession. But it really has been like that. So there is evidence heading back. We talked about African iron makers. They were smelting out, certainly thousands of years ago. There's evidence of the ancient Egyptians doing metalwork, and little known fact, some of the earliest anvils, because iron doesn't exist in its elemental state. You don't just walk through the bush and find a lump of iron. Because it's reactive, it oxidizes, it rusts away, and it returns to earth. So some of the earliest and certainly the only natural sources of elemental iron were meteorites. There is evidence in Egyptian tombs, certainly dating back, we're talking probably 3,000-4,000 years, of people finding these large iron objects and employing them as anvils to do metalwork on. Blacksmithing is incredibly old, and I wouldn't hazard to put a finger on how and where, because I just don't think that information really truly exists.
And by the time it got to Europe, I understand there's a connection between blacksmithing and the legend of King Arthur and his famous sword. Is that right?
Look, it's a story I love. And like all of those fables, you take it with a grain of sand. But an interpretation of this Arthurian legend of taking the sword from the stone, which I love, is that it was never about a literal stone and a literal sword. It wasn't that this sword was sticking out of this mythical stone, but it's actually more of a reference to the technology of the time. And again, it's wrapped up in this alchemy and Merlin being this wizard and this chemist and this alchemist. But they may well have been referring to the metallurgists of the time. Maybe Merlin was more of a metallurgist, and maybe the sword from the stone was more of a metaphor for being able to break down specific rocks that existed in nature at the time and being smelted in a certain way. And you've got to remember that for most of blacksmithing's existence, it's been a closely guarded family secret. It would have been handed down lines because it really was seen as supernatural in some ways.
I love those sort of more mundane explanations for legends and stories that kind of spin out of something that might have been quite straightforward. Really.
Yeah.
So blacksmiths back then were creating weapons like swords or horseshoes, then later doing work on railways. And now you're doing, as you said, more architectural work. I want to ask about the actual smithing process a bit more. How hot does the steel need to get before you can forge it into something?
Different steels will have different forging temperatures. So, for a lot of the modern steels that we forge in now, that could be between maybe 1,050 to 1,150 odd degrees. That's a pretty good upper window, but you can forge that right down until it gets towards maybe 850, 900 degrees Celsius. Wrought iron, which is a bit of an older material, it was some of the first industrially produced irons. It's what holds up the roof of Everleigh, for example.
Right.
Wrought iron has a much higher working temperature. So, it could get as hot as 1,300 or 1,400 degrees Celsius, which is very close to the melting point of iron. But you've got this window, and it's the thing, you put the energy into the system, and then you've got this finite little window to make your change, to affect it. And, it's almost metaphoric. You've got this little window to make this change, and then everything solidifies. And it's frozen and it's captured. And if you're happy with how it's captured, put it out into the world and let people love it and let people enjoy it for its beauty. If it's not finished, put more energy in, go again. And, blacksmithing is kind of infinitely recyclable in that way too.
Part of the way you learn this very old trade is something called the journeyman years.
Yes.
What is a journeyman?
It's very traditional for not just our trade, but a lot of old trades. So once you'd finish your apprenticeship, people are fairly familiar with the term masterpiece, but I think they have an unrealistic expectation of what it means. So a masterpiece is not the best thing you've ever created. It's not the monolith you've climbed. It's not you standing on top of the hill. Your masterpiece is just what it is. It's a piece you made for your master to show your skills at the end of your apprenticeship, and they would judge based upon that masterpiece whether they were proud to have you in the world representing them as a teacher. And that's what a masterpiece is. It was often the first great thing that you would create on your own, but certainly not the best and certainly hopefully not the last. So you would do your apprenticeship, you would create your masterpiece, and then you would journeyman, which was kind of being kicked out of the nest as a fledgling and You might go to the next village, depending on your means. You might go to the next village blacksmith and say, hey, I used to work with so-and-so. Here's some of my skills. What do you reckon? Do you want to put me on? What can I learn from you? Or you might travel across the country, or you might travel to another country. There are very different styles of ironwork coming out of the corners of the world. And, I've got a library full of books that details, the Persian artwork versus the Scottish interpretation and the Italian interpretation, the Eastern European interpretation. These areas would have had very different, much like dialect, I guess. You've got these areas of dialect within a metalwork community. And so to be able to go from areas of dialect and areas of influence that are the same as each other and learn things and see techniques, yeah.
And you spent some of your journeyman years in Italy with a man named Roberto Giordani. Tell me about him.
Roberto, he's become a dear friend of mine. I'd finished some time at Ultimo, and like I said, there wasn't a lot of employment opportunities. I sort of started a fairly small blacksmithing business, one-man band, bit of a village blacksmith, doing whatever I could. And then I had the opportunity to go and learn some sculpture with Roberto Giordani. And to paint the picture, so we drove into he took over this, I don't know what it was, but I think it used to be a place where priests live. It was a very old building that Roberto had taken over. We're driving down this beautiful dusty country road in Tuscany. He's got this wonderful sprawling kind of area with a workshop he's built, and it looks over these flowing fields. You look out of his workshop, and again, like, because we're blacksmiths and we love to build everything from scratch, he's got the centerpiece of the room is this forge with this beautiful curved flue. That's the chimney that funnels the fumes out of. So this space that you walk into, it's nothing like Everleigh. It's, Everleigh's awe-inspiring because of its scale and its industrial output through its era, but Roberto's space is inspiring for a completely different reason. You're in the middle of a field. You're overlooking flowing hills in Tuscany. You're overlooking this farmland, and you're eating beautiful local produce. Roberto's a wonderful host. He's a genuinely great cook. Oftentimes when you're on Journeyman, you might live with these people. You might stay with them, or you'll stay locally. And that's something that I try and continue as a tradition when I have guests out. Roberto, actually, I was very proud to host him at Everleigh a number of years ago, and we created a sculpture, 3.5 metre great white shark that we built together as a team with other New South Wales blacksmiths.
What did you learn in Italy from him that you brought back to your work here?
It was the shift of mindset of the approach. I don't think, there's no one tangible thing that I'd go, oh yeah, that's very Italian, but it was just it was being able to look at tools and material in a different way than I was taught here, in a less regimented, less strictly contained way. We forged some brass components together, which brasses are really difficult. It's not difficult when you've done it a few times, but it's very different to steel. It moves differently, it heats differently, it's got different forging temperatures. I did my first brass forgings with Roberto. I did my first titanium forging with Roberto. It was really nice to be exposed to these things that were outside of my formal education. I think that's the most profound thing for me. It was just the exposure to a completely different culture of metalwork. They've got their dialect, they've got their language.
It's like this hidden culture of blacksmiths that exists around the world that no one else really knows about.
Very super secret squirrel business.
So you said you now do a lot of architectural stuff and a lot of public art. What do you enjoy about that type of work?
I love working at the scale. I love the challenge of working at scale. We did a work with a local artist, Mello Callahan, she does some really, really beautiful and really out there stuff, and she's not sort of tied to any specific medium, but she came to me because she wanted to work in steel, and she had a concept of building these two enormous tuning forks. They're I think they're like 3 meters tall a piece, and they weigh hundreds of kilos. I can't remember by the time we finished, but it would certainly be in the vicinity of 500, 600, 700 kilos a piece, these tuning forks. We'd made a marquette, and this marquette was about 30 centimeters high, and it's just, a tuning fork is it's a simple thing. It's a straight, and it's a bend at the bottom, and then it's straight up the other side, and then it's got a base. How difficult
and is a marquette like a miniature?
Yeah, a little miniature, yeah. How hard can it be? But I've got photos of, I think we had 5 or 6 people hanging off a piece of steel that was as thick as your torso, pulling it around on a bench manually. We were heating it with big torches in the center where the U was going to be, and pulling it around through leverage and sheer
To get that
power
shape.
to get the U shape. And, you know, it's that kind of encapsulates it for me. It's like you can look at a form that is incredibly simple, but as soon as you try and scale it, you invite a whole swathe of difficulty, the material handling and the heating. How do you get enough energy into a piece of material that big? You know, you invite all of these things that you never have to consider when you're just working at an anvil at a smaller scale.
Yeah.
So I really, really love taking on those projects, and that for me, it's, you know, and the thing that keeps me engaged with blacksmithing. We talked about it earlier, but I love that, you know, nothing is new in blacksmithing. None of the techniques are ever going to be new, but the way that you employ them is going to be different every time. And that's what keeps me engaged with it. Is if you sat down and said, Maddie, I need you to make, for the next 20 years of your life, I'm going to give you $200,000 a year to make me this object over and over again, I would walk out of this studio and would never have a yarn again. Because I don't want to be doing the same thing. I want to be constantly feeling like every project I'm finding something out. I'm finding something out about the material. You know, in an introspective way, I might be finding out stuff about myself. You're constantly kind of discovering. That's what drives me about blacksmithing.
Is there a piece you've made that you're most proud of?
No, you can't say that. It's like asking someone. I've just had my first little bubba, and I couldn't imagine asking what your favourite child's going to be. But they're all different for their different challenges. You know, I've worked, one of my first big ones, this is one that sticks in my mind because it was probably the first large-scale sculpture I created, was with another fantastic Sydney artist who's become a dear friend, is Nell. We created these tree houses together with Cave Urban, and they sit not more than a couple of blocks from the workshop. They're in that same precinct. They were commissioned by Mervac, who owns the Loco workshop. And that was kind of how the relationship started. And I met this person, and we instantly kicked it off. And she's like me, you know, and I talked about this before, but it's like, she doesn't care about the medium. I don't care about the medium. It's creation. So she walked into that space and she saw it for its potential in her eyes, you know, through her lens. And so she was instantly inspired, and that inspires me and my team. And it's, you know, that feedback loop of energy, that cycling is. So that was the first really big piece, and it's these really gorgeous, I say cute. You'd never describe ironwork as cute, but they're these beautiful big gumnut shaped objects that you can climb up inside. They live up in the trees. They're about 4 or 5 meters off the ground, and there's these stairs and railings that kind of lead you through the forest. It almost feels like an elevated kind of boardwalk through these beautiful native trees. And then you can climb up into the bodies of these big gumnut entities. And they've got benches in there. It's a really contemplative space. I head down there. I take my little bubba down there. We'll go and sit up in there and we'll catch the breeze because it's 5 or 6 meters off the ground. You get a great breeze. You get the smells. And, you know, it's very evocative for me because they're the smells of being in the bush, you know, to bring it full circle.
Yeah.
I can go down there and it feels like I'm not sitting in the middle of Redfern. So that was a really important project for me, you know.
Your dad died before he got to see you become a blacksmith.
Yeah.
Do you think he would be proud of where you've ended up?
Dad was always proud of us anyway. You know, he was that kind of father. He was proud of all of us. And I know it wouldn't have mattered what I did, and it certainly doesn't matter what any of my siblings have achieved. They're all incredibly high-achieving individuals. I make the joke about being the black sheep of the family, the blacksmith of the family. You know, like they're all they're hugely accomplished lawyers and bankers, and like they're professionals. And it would never have mattered what we did if I wasn't fulfilling my potential and I wasn't, you know, trying to lead my field or trying to innovate or trying to create something that's really my own. I think that would have disappointed him. And the medium, he couldn't have cared about. It was just knowing that I was happy and that I was striving.
Matt, it's beautiful to hear you talk about your father and about blacksmithing. Thank you.
No, thanks so much for having me on.
This is Conversations with Sana Kadar.
My guest on Conversations today was Matt Mewburn, one of Australia's last blacksmiths and the custodian of the Everleigh Works. This episode of Conversations was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people. It was produced by Maggie Morris. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sana Kadar. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.